Good evening, and thanks for joining us tonight for our first New Canaan Talks Housing conversation. I'm Miki Porta, and I'm joined by my friend and co-host Beth Jones. Beth and I live and volunteer in New Canaan and have both had an interest in housing for a long time. This is partly personal because housing affordability is an issue for us, and partly out of our concerns over equity, economic development, and the environment. We're excited to kick it off with this talk, which we see as the why of it. Why housing? Why these ideas? Why now? This is kind of like the hot book that everyone's talking about, and we have the author here to tell us why and how she wrote it. We're not here to tell anyone what to think. We're simply providing access to one of the primary sources behind these ideas in order to get some context and clarity for this ongoing issue. We hope it will lead to a thoughtful and factual discussion about the housing challenges affecting all communities across our state, including New Canaan. Before we get started, a few housekeeping items. First off, this event is being recorded. A link to the recording will be shared with you after tonight's discussion. On the agenda this evening, first we'll hear a presentation from Sara Bronin, followed by a conversation with us and audience Q&A. Please submit your questions through the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screens, and take a second now to find it if you haven't used it before. If you have trouble, please let us know in the Zoom chat. We now have over 160 people on this call, and I'm sure that those of us here tonight represent different ages, genders, racial and ethnic backgrounds, economic statuses, professions, and political persuasions. We also are neighbors with a common concern for our town and state, and it's our hope that we can listen with open minds and learn from one another's perspectives and experiences. Tonight, we're very pleased to welcome Sara Bronin, founder and lead organizer of Desegregate, Connecticut, which describes itself as a coalition of neighbors and nonprofits who believe in creating abundant, diverse housing in service of equity, inclusive prosperity, and a cleaner environment. Again, because zoning and land use policy are a hot topic, and because Desegregate Connecticut and some of its initiatives have been much commented on, we felt it was important to first invite Sara to New Canaan for two main reasons. First, so that New Canaan could hear about Desegregate Connecticut's goals, research, and policy proposals straight from the source. And second, so that New Canaan residents could ask the questions that are important to us directly to one of the thought leaders in this ongoing civic debate. Sara Bronin is a Mexican-American architect, attorney, and policymaker specializing in property, land use, historic preservation, and climate change law. She holds an endowed chair at the UConn School of Law, where she serves as chair of the institution's Center for Energy and Environmental Law, and she advises the National Trust for Historic Preservation and the Sustainable Development Code. Sara has served as a visiting professor at the Yale School of Architecture and the Sorbonne in Paris. She was educated at Yale Law School, Oxford, and the University of Texas. Sara, welcome to New Canaan, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much, Miki, and I'm going to share my slides. As I'm doing that, I just wanted to say thank you to everybody who has taken their night to talk about zoning. It's actually, as a land use professor, it's sort of my dream come true that anybody's interested in zoning, much less so many people around the state. So I'm hopeful that this can be a productive conversation and that we can figure out how we can move forward together in a way that's just positive. Just by way of quick background, as was noted, I'm a law professor, but I also chaired my city's Planning and Zoning Commission for 7 years. I obviously have a relative in local government, and so thinking about the role of local governments within our broader constellation of I guess of stars or local governments in Connecticut is something that I've done a lot of. So far be it, my perspective, I guess, is really primarily a local perspective. And this is the first time I've worked on a statewide level. So I appreciate your indulgence in considering that as you think about how we've gone about this movement. So this movement really started over the summer of 2020, which seems like a decade ago now, when so much was happening in the world, and not just the pandemic, but things that probably many of us didn't even realize were so entrenched in our society. We started meeting in June. I just convened a group of architects and planners and attorneys to come together, and believe it or not, 230 people, including some from this community, joined that conversation. And all I said was, do you guys want to talk about how land use laws hurt Connecticut or hurt some of the people in our community? And it turned out people really did. And so from there, I did not plan to start anything really, but it just kind of snowballed in a way that I think is very positive for the ongoing conversation and for the proposals that you'll hear about next. We developed over time a coalition of many different partners. We have 65, and they might all be on this screen. They're mostly on this screen. That have ranged from the statewide groups of professionals, which include the planners and the architects, environmental groups, you'll hear more about those in a moment, of course, social justice groups, groups interested in biking and walking, because our proposals will help to aid in that. And finally, the Connecticut Conference of Municipalities, who we reached out to very early on in our discussions and continue to engage and dialogue with throughout the course of the development of the proposals you'll hear about tonight. So I just want to talk first about what is zoning. And, I teach property law, I teach land use law. Some of you I know who signed up for the event tonight have participated in the land use process in New Canaan, and even as architects or planners or lawyers in other towns. So some of you are very familiar with this. But for those who are not, zoning is land use control of structures, lots, and uses. So zoning controls how big something is, where it goes on the lot, how big lots are, and what the buildings can be used for within any town. In Connecticut, like in every other state in the country, there is a State Zoning Enabling Act. And it is that state law that says this is what local governments can do when they exercise the zoning power, and this is what they cannot do. So this law was adopted in Connecticut about a century ago. It's been modified a number of times since then. I do want to point out, and this is just, I've just pulled it up because it was such a nice example or a nice summary of the way Connecticut regulates or the relationship between the state and local government. So I also do state and local government law. Connecticut is primarily what's called a Dillon's Rule state. And this is, again, just from the Office of Legislative Research. Dillon's Rule says, I'll pull this up, that municipalities can only exercise the powers that the state gives them. So already, just in our basic case law and just the Connecticut Supreme Court and our tradition here, there is this overarching view of state power as being one where the state essentially grants explicitly authority to local governments to do certain things. That's in contrast to other states, which are called home rule states. I do want to just make that distinction as we go on. We are working within that framework. So we're working with the Enabling Act that already exists to try to modify it in ways that we think will help very broadly improve Connecticut in a few very specific ways. We're not involved in any litigation against towns. That we're really solely focused on a legislative approach that might help to improve Connecticut. So if I can find my cursor here. These are the three reasons that we've come together. And as you might imagine, with 65 different organizations, each one of them has different motives. Some of them are motivated, as was I when I originally put this group together, by equity. And you can see that in the name of the organization, which again was determined early on during the summer with that equity lens. As we talked more about zoning reform with more people, other organizations gravitated toward what we're doing because of the ability for economic development and for the potential for vibrancy, increased vibrancy in what is a slow growth state. And then finally, others came to our movement for environmental reasons. We have a lot more on our website about all of these reasons. There's a page called Background, and it has links to different studies that I'll only reference now. As a professor, I always go to what does the research say? And so you'll see a lot of links on our website, maybe too much to research. But with that in mind, I did want to just briefly talk about each of these things. So equity. And so some people, I mean, we had this public hearing on Monday, And we did get some questions with some legislators who were very skeptical of the bill that we're supporting, which is SB 1024, about whether zoning leads to segregation or whether there's any link between zoning and either racial or income-based segregation. There is a lot of research about this. There's been a lot of research in Connecticut about this, and a lot of it ties to what we recognize in the past were very, the impulse, and in fact, the impulse of much of zoning when it first developed 100 years ago was one of, let's try to order our town to keep certain people out. Whether we like it or not, a lot of those structures are still in place today, and it may not, and in fact, I'm confident that it's no one's intent that they be exclusionary. But to the extent that they are, we do have to recognize that historically there was a link, and there really remains a link today. We also heard the phrase on Monday, a lot of one size fits all commentary. And I do think one of the people who testified kind of turned that on its head. And I want to lift up his characterization, which is right now, Connecticut does have what I would consider one size fits all zoning. The vast majority of the state is for single family zoning on large lots. And this is what that looks like. Every time you see a map, I'm going to give you a lot of maps today that are based on a project called the Zoning Atlas. And every time you see a map, the purple is the hit, it's the positive. So everywhere you see purple here is where single family housing is allowed as of right. That means without a public hearing on the individualized application. So you can see single family housing really dominates the state. And I'll talk about the economic consequences of that in a moment. But from an equity perspective, it does raise questions about what people are able to afford in communities. I want to make an important point, though. Even though I showed you that last slide, our goal is not to, as some movements have done in other states, abolish single family zoning, nor are we seeking to put multifamily housing everywhere. And I think that's a really important point, because I don't want to conflate any of those other movements with what we're doing. Now, I want to come back to the economic argument for zoning reform. Through the Zoning Atlas project, and it's available on our website, it's an interactive map, and again, you'll see screenshots of it today. We've seen a very fragmented approach to land use regulation, even in similarly situated communities in the same part of the state. We think that what that has done, this high level of fragmentation in Connecticut, is it has really hindered economic growth. And housing is just one aspect, and housing production is just one aspect of economic growth. And we'll talk about links to that in other areas in just a couple slides. But we are 47th in population growth. We are 49th in GDP growth. We are very, very slow growing, and we can feel that. We still haven't, in many places, recovered from the Great Recession. What zoning contributes to that is zoning can make housing too expensive. If you just zone for one kind of housing, it constrains the market. It locks in an aging population. And what do I mean by that? If you have children, or if you are a young person yourself, you may not want to live in the kind of housing that Connecticut offers. And the kind of housing Connecticut offers is very much tied to zoning. We've heard, and actually there are reports from economic development organizations all over the state, that there is not enough housing to house workers. There was testimony on Monday from small business owners who keep trying to recruit people, and they keep losing people when they find how expensive housing is here and how they don't really have that many options other than the one size fits all single family house on a large lot. We're also letting what many people would call prime developable land go to waste. And by developable land, I should say, I'm an environmentalist, I'm a preservationist. I just stepped down as chair of Preservation Connecticut. My thought of developable land is not the green fields out in our forests. It is the developable land around our main streets and transit stations. So I'll get more about that in a moment. So we're an aging population. Here's the bell curve of sorts in the 2000s. Here we are in the 2020s. The number of people has shifted up. A greater percentage of our population is older. We do know that building more housing allows for more units, more income for individuals. It creates more revenues for local government. This is a study showing what 1,500 units of multi-housing will do. And of course, it creates construction jobs, which is why you see the carpenters and other, others supporting our movement. I have to go a little faster. All right, environment. We all know climate change is affecting the environment, sea level rise, et cetera, et cetera. What causes that? Well, there's a lot of different causes, but one cause of increasing greenhouse gas emissions, and in fact, the health effects that go with that, is that we are building sprawl in Connecticut. So that zoning that I talked about, what it does is it forces new housing to go outward. It forces us to develop outward from our historic cores, and that creates, again, sprawl. It causes us to build more roads. It causes us to drive more. It also, in a very general sense, is more energy inefficient in that single family housing. In terms of use per square foot, because you're not insulated by housing next door. It's just an energy inefficient way to build, and not just the transportation energy, but of course the electric energy too. So we have observed, and various people have studied, including UConn's Clear Institute, that we are sprawling outward. We're decimating our farmland as well as our forest, and we're not using land wisely. So a central theme in what we're trying to do is to put development where it already exists. If there's a housing demand, why don't we create opportunities to not push it outward, but instead try to develop it where we have some development that already exists? All right, so proposals. So you can see these on our website. I'm not going to go into every one today, but I'll go into a few. So the first one is accessory dwelling units, or ADUs. In the bill, they call them accessory apartments. On the left, you see from our zoning atlas where accessory dwelling units are allowed at all. On the right, you see where accessory dwelling units are allowed without certain constraints, without a public hearing, without the restriction that the occupants be non-family or non-employee renters, and with the allowance that they can be detached instead of attached. Accessory dwelling units, so here are just some very basic images about what they might look like. They might be on a garage apartment, they might be a third floor, they might be in a walkout basement. Our proposal is that they be allowed as of right. We'll come back to that term in a moment, but it means without an individualized public hearing. We are proposing that they be 30% of the single family dwelling, and that they be allowed whether they're attached or detached, and that renters should be allowed. And also, and this is maybe too specific about the denominator, so I'll skip that for now. Now I want to go to how this will change New Canaan. So the zoning atlas on the left shows you what characteristics I've selected. And I did this in these parts so that you can see what the images show. This shows you where New Canaan allows accessory dwelling units as of right, without a restriction on family or employees. It allows renters. It's not restricted to elderly only. And you can see 96% of New Canaan really checks all the boxes that we've suggested in our legislation. The only thing that would change in New Canaan with our legislation is that, subject to your architectural standards, it would allow detached units. So the kind of garage apartment or carriage house conversions of those of a single family in a single family property, it would allow that. So again, New Canaan is almost a poster child for what accessory dwelling units should be, the legislation for it, and so I really applaud that. Actually, New Canaan allows for the size of the accessory dwelling unit to be more than our 30% that we're proposing. You actually allow it to be 40%. So again, with that one change, it would satisfy this legislation. New Canaan can still have architectural standards, can still require owner occupancy as you do, and can limit short-term rentals like Airbnb, which I'm not sure if it's a problem in your community, but if it is, you may already limit it, but you can if it is a problem in your community. The law specifically says that that's what towns should be able to do. And by the way, we came up with this rule not out of thin air, this proposal out of thin air. We collaborated with, at this point, thousands of people in dozens of meetings throughout the state, with planning and zoning commissions, with elected officials, with professional planners, zoning enforcement officials, of course, tons of individual property owners. And that's where we came up with these ideas and carved out these parameters for what towns should do. They didn't just come out of thin air. The second proposal I wanted to talk about was this Main Street proposal. And so it does not have to be your main street. You can see Water Street here in Stonington, which I'm sure some of you have visited, allows two-family housing up and down the main street. So what we're saying is we want for towns to select from a menu of types of housing units, 2 to 4 units of housing, allow those as of right within a quarter mile of a commercial area. So that's within a 5-minute walk of some commercial strip. This proposal only applies to towns with 7,500 people or more, so it would apply to New Canaan. What New Canaan would still be able to do in these proposals is, again, establish architectural standards for these units, choose what types of housing, we call it middle housing sometimes, 2 to 4 units, what types within that, duplexes, townhomes, triplexes, and what those would look like. You're the ones that choose which corridor in town that you want to satisfy the criteria, and you're the ones that choose the 50% within that radius. Okay, so how did we come up with this proposal? So I want to just point out that there are several professional groups that are the 3 statewide preservation organizations: Preservation Connecticut, Connecticut Preservation Action, Connecticut Main Street Center, and the AIA, which has many preservation architects, because we're Connecticut, we're an old state, we have a lot of that, work together to advise on these proposals, which they believe will help to strengthen small businesses and help to preserve some properties that right now are not actually zoned to allow housing. But if we did allow housing in those properties, they would be able to be rehabilitated and come to life. So I want to come back to what as of right actually means. It means able to be approved in accordance with the terms of a zoning regulation and without requiring an individualized public hearing for the individual project. Now, some people have said, well, that means there's no public hearing whatsoever, but the amendments in SB 1024 apply only to section 8-2. And the surrounding provisions of that. They do not apply to 8-3. So this is 8-3. And this says, whoops, I went back. This says how a zoning regulation is applied. It has to be applied, it has to be amended with a public hearing. It has to be noticed. It has to be, at a public meeting. And typically what happens, as happened in Hartford when we redid our zoning regulations, actually 14 times when I was chair, we amended the zoning regulations. It was always a big public process. We had a lot of public meetings. We met with stakeholders. We didn't just do it overnight, and we weren't legally allowed to do it without a public hearing. So the process of adopting zoning regulations does involve a public hearing. What we're suggesting is that individualized applications not have their own individual public hearing. That has been a study to be a proven way to actually enable that kind of development. So you might be asking, okay, has New Canaan ever done this before? Is this going to be some big change for New Canaan? And I just wanted to point out to you here in this area that I'm showing on this slide, this is where 2-family housing is already allowed as of right. And I think I'm going to go through a few of these images really quickly. This is where 2-family housing is allowed after a public hearing. So for the Main Street proposal, so if you go back to the as of right, this is where 2-family housing is already allowed right now without a public hearing. This is where 2-family housing is allowed generally. Actually, you have a nice chunk of land that's zoned for 2-family housing already. The difference between the last slide and this slide is in this slide, you're requiring public hearings for 2-family housing. However, based on the last slide, it seems as if New Canaan has found a way to establish guidelines for staff to approve applications for 2-family housing in these zones, probably giving them architectural standards already. So in order to satisfy our Main Street proposal, you might decide to pick New Norwalk Road. It's already a prime candidate, or maybe this part of Main Street down here, and convert some of that zoning from You already allow 2-family, but just convert it to as of right, meaning that you set out architectural standards in that area, sort of set it and forget it. I don't know if that's some commercial. I don't know what I'm channeling here, but you approve the projects at a staff level. Again, it's not as if 2-family housing is not allowed in a pretty good chunk of New Canaan already. I think you've proven that you can do it, and I don't think that will be that hard for New Canaan to comply with. Here's another example of things you might be surprised at. There's already a significant portion of downtown, I guess you would call it downtown-ish or central New Canaan, that where you allow 3-family housing. That's what all the purple means here. And actually, you allow 3-family housing in nearly your entire town, 96% of your town, if it's elderly housing. So again, you have probably more zoning for 2, 3, and 4-family housing that you think. But let's just come back to this 2-family housing again. Here's where it's allowed. You'd be picking an area here, an area to convert 2-family to from with a public hearing to without, and then you can call it a day. All right, so next proposal that I want to talk about is transit-oriented development. So TOD, it really means focusing development around transit hubs. This has been something that has been adopted in other states. This is a report about Massachusetts's transit hubs and how focusing housing on those areas can actually help in a lot of different respects, both with housing supply of housing that's more affordable, as well as economic growth generally. So after this report came out in October, well, this is what the report said. Actually, Brookings gave testimony on our bill, SB 1024. Just going back, Massachusetts has adopted unanimously and with Republican Governor Charlie Baker's championing it, transit-oriented development legislation very similar to what we're proposing here. So Massachusetts just adopted this half-mile around transit, and they're very, very proud of it. Again, near unanimously in the legislature on a bipartisan basis, because it's recognized the value that it brings to all sides of the political debate. What Brookings said about this bill is that transit-oriented development, we have not coordinated our development in a positive way here. It's distorting regional labor markets, driving up emissions, entrenching residential segregation. The report that I just pointed out focuses on Connecticut, but Brookings, and again, we can't get Brookings to say this stuff. I mean, they wrote it because they knew that we were doing this. They said Connecticut faces similar, if not worse, challenges. What the Regional Plan Association has discovered in looking at Fairfield County train stations, New Jersey, and I believe Long Island transit stations, is that a lot of the area around transit stations is zoned for large lot residential, which doesn't make that much sense if we think that that is an area where we should be putting more housing, so we don't put housing in the outskirts of town where it causes environmental degradation. All right, so our proposal is that within a half-mile radius of a train station, 50% should be zoned multifamily of 4 units. Our proposal is 4 units. It is not 80 units. It is not 1,000 units. It is not condos falling from the sky. It is 4 units. So 4 units of housing. If the town wants to do more, the town can do more. If the town allows 10 units, we're saying 10% of that housing needs to be affordable. Outside of that radius, we would be extracting, the legislation proposes to extract anything that is environmentally sensitive lands. So again, our coalition members include the Sierra Club, Save the Sound, Norwalk River Watershed Association, and their testimony and one of the reasons why they support what we're doing, and if you care about the environment, you can start to make that link too, is because it puts housing where it already exists. Oh, Trust for Public Land. Sorry, I forgot about Trust for Public Land, a great partner, and the American Society of Landscape Architects. Okay, there you go. So in addition to that half-mile radius, I want to point out, because it's relevant to New Canaan, a provision that we added in the bill as a result of Darien First Select Person Jamie Stevenson's very good suggestion, which was, what if the geography doesn't allow you to to put all of that housing in within the half-mile radius. There's a provision in SB 1024 that hasn't been talked about enough, which says that for towns, you can actually satisfy the requirement of that percentage of land in the half-mile radius within a 1 mile radius, which is a farther walk, a 20-minute walk, but you can still satisfy that requirement by zoning for as of right multifamily housing within a 1 mile radius if it's connected to the train station with walking facilities. So how does that play out in New Canaan? Oh, here's my at least four, at least four, at least four. So 4 is all you have to do. You don't have to permit anything more than 4. Okay, I think I've beaten that horse. The town decides how many units, the architecture, and the location within the radius. Oh, I think I'm missing a slide here. So going back to, let me just get, shoot, I think I'm missing a slide. I may have to go to the zoning atlas. What I would have shown here, and maybe it'll come up in just a second, is an image that shows you where the radius is and where 4-family housing is already allowed within the radius and outside of the radius as of right. And I think you'll be surprised at that. So maybe it'll come up in just a second. We're also proposing changing parking. So parking is another reason why we had so many environmental and preservation groups sign on. More parking, studies have shown that more parking leads to more driving. The more parking you require, the more driving you have, the more all of the terrible effects of cars, which we all use but hate to. Our proposal for parking is that for housing within a half-mile of transit or within those main streets, there not be a parking requirement, and that those be then, but that people, if they want to build parking, they can, but that the whole point of those areas is to encourage walkability. In other parts of town, we would cap it at 1 per studio apartment requirement or 2 per 2-bedroom or more. Many towns already do not require parking in these places or satisfy our proposals. In fact, the average number of parking spaces for a studio or 1-bedroom apartment or even a 2-bedroom is 1.1 to 1.25 spaces, including in your part of Fairfield County. So property owners, again, can still, and developers will, if they feel they need it, add spaces. So in New Canaan now, most housing is 2 spaces per unit. Some studio and 1-bedroom housing is 1.5. So the bill would not change your typical single family or 2-bedroom parking. It would, however, reduce the parking from 1.5 to 1 space per studio or 1-bedroom. If there had been more time, you would have heard from a couple of parking experts in the public hearing on Monday. All right, last couple of things, model form-based code. This is the state assembling a team of people with a diverse range of professional qualifications. The COGS would provide some assistance. The towns would adapt and adopt. A form-based code allows you to articulate this concept of character. They are optional. They are free to New Canaan. It's a state optional service. It's a model code. I'm not sure, there was some testimony and some statements that this is something that every town will have to do. It's an opportunity to take something that the state is just putting out there and adapt it and adopt it for your own use if you don't have a model-based code, which I don't think you do. So what changes in New Canaan? Allowed detached ADUs. Depending on the condition, there might be more lots in the transit-oriented development that are zoned from that, converting from the from the public hearing to as of right, which again, New Canaan already has a pretty healthy percentage of or number of as of right lots. It reduces parking requirements in the TOD, Main Street studios, and 1-bedrooms. You have to do commissioner training. That's something that we've heard loud and clear from a lot of, frankly, first select people around the state, but also the planning commissioners themselves. They want to have the training. And then I just say free stuff because there's the model code that would be available to towns. So that's all I have. We always, if you ever want to keep track of what we're doing, you can always text zoning to 313131. And I think I'm going to stop there. Sorry for to go so long.
Thank you so much, Sarah. That was fascinating. So now we're going to get into our Q&A session. The first question we have for you are all these ideas you've brought forward. Why are these being characterized as a loss of local control or home rule?
You know, I'm not a politician. I don't have good answers for that question. I think sometimes people have a knee-jerk reaction to change of any kind, and I think that may be the case here. And part of this may be, you know, I think frankly, you know, it might have been our name. It might have been the fact that, you know, while I'm pretty familiar with my in-laws have lived in your part of the world for some time. I just, you know, myself didn't sort of make it down. I did not realize that this would be, I'm so naive. I didn't realize this would become political. So perhaps I did not get ahead of it to make these kinds of presentations earlier and just say, this is working within an established framework. Lots of towns are actually should be touting themselves as success stories, including New Canaan. I mean, as I said, your ADU provisions are perfect. Except for that, you know, that this would then say unlock the potential for the homeowners on this call, frankly, to do more with their properties. So it's a win for individual property owners who want to convert their garage to an ADU. So I don't know. You know, I don't. I guess it's politics, and I should have expected that, but I didn't. So here we are. So I'm here now.
Great, thanks. So we have a lot of specific questions. Are you ready, Sarah? There's some.
Shoot them out. Yep.
We're digging in. Okay. So there's one here that's talking about SB 1024. It references mixed-use development at a minimum of 15 units per acre. Please elaborate on what that means and why a minimum of 15 is the right density. Also, second part to that, SB 24 also requires the 2 to 4 unit middle housing within a half mile of transit to be 15 dwelling units per acre. Our existing multifamily districts in New Canaan range in density from 4 to 8 dwelling units per acre. So it sounds like your proposal could nearly double the potential existing density. That's a question. That's a lot of words.
Yes. So why don't I do this? I'm going to share my screen again. And this is, we've had many different volunteers who have worked on our projects. This is actually just, it's a sketch. It's not done yet, but this is what 15 acres, 15 units per acre could look like. I think there's actually more units here than 15.
Sarah, can you hold on a minute? I'm getting a message that the audio cut out when I asked you the question.
Oh, sure.
So let me ask that question again, because it was really specific. It was about, where did the question go?
I think that what I heard the question.
Can you repeat it? Yeah, can you repeat it?
What I heard the question was what does 15 units per acre look like? So I just kind of showed you a preview, and I haven't either. There's sort of graphic issue. I'm an architect as well, so I look at that and I think this is just a very sketch from one of our students. But 15 units per acre is the equivalent of what the Massachusetts Transit-Oriented Development Bill had in its bill. And if you, and I don't want to go back to the screen, but it really, it's not a high rise. It's not a, I mean, I guess if New Canaan wanted to put a single high rise on 1 acre, they could do that. But it does allow for the kind of small scale development that I think you already have in that area. In your central district, you have lots that are zoned for 1/4 acre, which is fairly small. You have lots zoned for 1/2 acre. So what the proposal would not require you to put more units than 4 on a lot to satisfy the 15 units per acre. What it means is that the town can't prevent a large lot if somebody happens to have a 1 acre lot in your downtown, which I don't think there is one, looking at just my eyeballing of how the settlement patterns look from satellite. It just means if somebody has a very large lot, that it might, they can't cap that. But again, so it's sort of it's a global cap, but in no lot would there have to be more than 4 units. So.
Thank you.
Okay, the next question is, I have been told that the as of right language in the bill regarding accessory apartments and multifamily development within a 1/2 mile of a transit center mean that the property owner can develop a project as of right? What local zoning requirements remain? Setback, height, density, etc.
Yes, great question. So all of the local zoning requirements remain. The only thing that changes is that there is not a individual public hearing. So in other words, so going back to this idea, I'll just use a form-based code as an example. Well, actually, you already know how to do this in New Canaan because you already have two-family as of right development. So all of that area within that first slide that I showed you with the 2 acre and 3 acre and 4 acre is actually identical to that 2 acre slide, and I could go back to it, but you've already written setback rules, height requirements here. And again, I'll just to kind of keep the images in your mind. You've already, in this area that you see right here, you've already written setback rules, height requirements, density requirements. You might have things about how many windows, where the door could be, where the accessory structures might be allowed. This is where you've already done that. What as of right means is that none of these lots, if somebody wants to develop 2, 3, or 4 family housing on these lots, New Canaan doesn't bring them in for a zoning commission hearing. And that's the only thing that we're saying when we say as of right. All it's saying is it's got to be done. And going back to that, if I can find it, going back to the that definition of as of right, everything remains the same. The only thing that's different is the hearing part. And again, you've shown that you can do that. See, it says here, it has to be approved in accordance with the zoning regulations. Well, who writes the zoning regulations? It's your zoning commission or your town council, and it's with public hearings, as you saw in this next slide. So I think that's a confusion. And again, we're trying to get that message out. So I'm grateful for the question.
Great, thank you. So we have some questions here specifically. Can you further explain lines 440 and 441 in the bill? This has been troublesome for many in the community and is leading to fear. There's another one about this. What about lines 440 to 442 that require a minimum transit-oriented development density of 15 units per acre in the half mile?
Yeah, I think this is the same question as the one before. So this is I'm really glad I did these screenshots. You guys are very detail oriented. So it's a minimum density of 15 units per acre, at least 50% of the area. Well, I think they said 440, 441. So that's coming back to that minimum 15 units per acre. That is in the TOD provision. And one of the reasons, again, is that is the equivalent to the Massachusetts provision. So I guess, the way we really look at it is, what does Connecticut need to do to be at least conceptually competitive with this state that is taking, well, I can see from my law students, taking a lot of our brightest and best talent. The kinds of people who want to live around train stations and not have cars are young people, and frankly also our aging population who would love to stay in their towns, but don't have the kind of housing that they need in the town, just because, in part because of zoning. They don't have housing that is smaller, that doesn't have a yard, and that they might have a neighbor, a duplex or a townhouse or something like that. We're not producing that kind of housing. So we want to be competitive with Massachusetts. And that's why we have that. That's an overarching, so for example, let me just say, so for example, let's say around your train station, you had a giant 4 acre lot. The town would not be able to say that person, for example, could not subdivide the lot in accordance with the zoning regulations and then develop housing on that lot that's 15 units per acre. So we would again, that's maybe I have to figure out how to say that in a way that it also confirms that it's 4 units in ordinary circumstances as the zone requires. And then 1 acre and half acre zoning in the half mile TOD. I'm just reading one of the comments. I can go back to the TOD slide. But go ahead. I don't want to keep going back and forth between the screens.
So you ready for the next question?
Sure.
Could you explain the mechanisms to the bills that will ensure that any housing that is created will in fact be affordable? Is it due to higher densities, subsidies from outside sources?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. We've gotten that question a lot, especially from people in your communities. The research from the NYU Furman Center and other places is on our website, and essentially what the most recent research says is that the more supply of housing you create, the more a kind of trickle down effect happens in the region or in the community at large. The reason that housing prices are so high in your part of the state, and frankly, and even in our part of the state up here in Hartford, is that we're not producing housing that meets the needs of our community. So people who want housing have less choice, and that drives up prices. Right now, we're in a grand experiment with this because of COVID. Our market for the first time has seen a big increase in demand. And when that happens, demand increases, our supply is decreased. We don't have enough homes on the market, and we don't even have homes in production right now. Again, in part because of restrictive zoning. So we see that, again, seeing right before our eyes, the lack of supply is leading to higher prices. The more housing we can build, the more affordable we will be as a state. So I encourage folks to look at our data page on our website.
Thank you.
Okay, that's great. Question. Does this legislative proposal eliminate the ability to deny applications based on parking and traffic?
Nope, actually the legislation empowers towns to consider a standard that they are not really allowed to consider now in terms of traffic and vehicle management. And it doesn't require, it enables towns to use what's called a vehicle miles traveled standard, which actually California as a state has adopted for all of its construction projects as a state. And what the vehicle miles traveled standard does is it allows you a town to look at how many car trips a facility, or in this case housing, generates, and then to require that developer to provide amenities to the community in terms of sidewalks, in terms of crosswalks, in terms of bike racks, and other on and off-site improvements. This bill actually specifically empowers planning and zoning commissions to consider that standard and make that requirement of property owners. So this is an expansion of town powers in that regard.
Thanks.
Okay.
Okay, now we've got one regarding transit-oriented development. You mentioned 4 units, but in what size lot? And what would the minimum for size and percentage of coverage be for 4 units?
So the lot coverage and the lot size is up to the individual towns. So whatever you permit in the TOD area is what would stick. So a lot of people have asked us, why didn't you tackle minimum lot size? Because it really, minimum lot size does certainly have a correlation between the kind of housing that's developed and the kind of driving that we do and the sprawl and the increased cost of infrastructure to towns. Because if you think about it, the bigger the minimum lot, the farther the houses are, the more it costs to get to each house, the more expensive it is on a per unit basis for a town than serving a duplex in your historical town center. Just the amount of road, the location of that housing on a per unit basis, it's a lot less for town infrastructure, utility infrastructure, and so on. So where was I going with that? I can't remember.
Well, we have another question.
Okay,
when
good.
you remember, we can come back.
I guess what I was going with that. I guess where I was going with that was people have asked us, why didn't you sort of deal with the minimum lot size issue? The reason is because we consulted so widely with people that we heard that a lot of people like the minimum lot sizes that exist now because some people really like the amount of room and space, and people feel like it's environmentally sound for these to have high minimum lot sizes. So we sort of left that alone, but in reality, just for your own information, the opposite is really true. The higher the minimum lot size, the more infrastructure and the more environmental degradation that you actually see. But again, we're not tackling that in our legislation.
Okay. Are there any examples of towns or cities that have adopted this in their population, and did it create more diversity?
Yeah, so that's a great question too. So I guess is there an indication in the question about whether they're talking about accessory dwelling units or?
No, it was very general. It was
So
very
I mean, I
general.
can talk about the three main proposals, I guess. For accessory dwelling units, it's actually one of the AARP's top priorities for affordable housing for seniors and for greater diversity in communities. ADUs also allow seniors to age in place, because oftentimes what you see is actually a senior who has an ADU will live in the ADU and rent out the main house. So in terms of just diversity for people on fixed incomes, in particular, ADUs can be a really effective way to do that. For transit-oriented development and Main Street type housing, you do see, again, people who might not be attracted to small town life in a single family large lot might be attracted to small town life in a walkable area around again, one of our charming historic commercial cores, where they might want to live on top of a retail space, or they might want to have a little townhouse like you saw in the New London image. So you might it attracts a different kind of people than currently exist in Connecticut towns. Now, are our proposals going to completely change the racial demographic of towns like New Canaan or really even rural towns in Connecticut? I think the answer is certainly not. It's not a standalone solution to the problem of racial segregation. However, our goal is to loosen up some of the restrictions on the towns have that might be thwarting a lot of different kinds of diversity that we're not even thinking about, but including income diversity, which correlates with race, as we know.
Okay, here's an interesting one. How can we be part of your coalition?
Oh, great. I mean, you could, there's a page on our website that has the team page. We have a partnerships coordinator. And by the way, our team page is a lot of young people. And I'm really so proud of everything that they've been trying to do. They come from all parts of the state, including Lower Fairfield County. Everything that they've been doing, they're doing this, they're involved, I think, because they think it's exciting and it hits on a lot of goals. And right now there's not a lot of hope for them. And actually, to a person, they all say, we want to live in Connecticut, but we can't because it's too expensive. We actually have to go to high-priced Boston or New York to get housing that we could get the same kind of, have more amenities and more young people, and we just need to kind of flip that on its head. So that's what they're working for. But anyway, to answer the question, email me, our partnerships coordinator. We'd be happy to have you, and happy to find more voices in your part of the state to say, this really isn't that bad.
Great. Another specific question, will 0 parking spots be required in the half-mile circle required by the 15 units per acre area?
So yes, so the no minimum parking. So you guys, the difference between New Canaan and many other towns is that you're already fairly developed in and around your train station. Again, from my sort of basic knowledge of your town, and again, my eyeballing it from the satellite. So you already actually have the parking that you need, most likely built into what's already there. Some towns which are sort of starting on a blank slate might say, well, what do we do with no minimum parking? What many towns have done is, and in communities all over, Cambridge, Massachusetts being one, that you don't see parking on each and every lot. What you see is shared parking, is neighborhood parking, block parking, parking managed by the city, or the town. Some of you may have seen there was an op-ed by the chairman or the CEO of the Parking Authority of New Haven, saying that they were signing on board to desegregate Connecticut because they think there's a better way to manage parking, and they think New Haven is worse if it has curb cuts in for every lot. So parking, and again, Norman Garrick, my colleague at UConn, has studied this a lot. And if you really think about it, parking on each and every lot means a curb cut on each and every lot. And that means that you're detracting from the walkability that actually was part of the historic charm of our cities. So again, I'm a big preservationist, and that's my bias, but I do think people will figure out parking, because if you have a car, you're going to figure out where to put it.
Okay, we're almost out of time, so we've only got time for a couple more questions, but are there any incentives or requirements that ADUs or multifamily units be considered affordable in this area beyond market drivers?
No. So on the ADUs, it sounds like the person may have some background on the ADUs. What we've said there is that they actually don't count against a town's 830G denominator. They're not a penalty to the town. So if the town creates an ADU, it's not counted as a new dwelling unit that you have to take that 10% from. When you think about this other statute that we're not touching, other than this, for the Main Street and TOD housing, if New Canaan allows 10 units in those areas, the law triggers a 10% affordability requirement. So it does do that for 10 or more units. And the reason for that is that if you're building that densely around a train station or around a main street, then let's benefit those people who, to make that move toward, back to the question about, will this really lead to greater integration? That requirement, if you're building at that scale, we think there's a good reason for the state to have that scale of housing provide for affordable requirements. So those are the two couple of things that I would just say about that.
Okay, so last question. We've heard that under the proposed bills, other towns would have authority over development within a certain radius of transit hubs. For instance, Norwalk would have authority to develop within New Canaan because it has authority over a 15-mile radius of its transit hub, which encroaches into New Canaan. Is that true?
No, that is definitely not true. So the your zoning authority as a town extends to your jurisdiction and nothing else. Nothing in this bill would change that. That would be rather dramatic. And no, we have situations like that, Hartford and West Hartford, we have a Connecticut fast track station on our border. It's Hartford's jurisdiction that governs that. Our side is West Hartford that governs the other side. And that can't change. I don't even think it, I don't even know if it could be changed by state law because of the way that municipal powers are developed.
Well, I think we're at the end of our evening. We're just about out of time. Miki and I would like to thank all of you so much for joining us tonight, especially Sara. We've learned so much, and I hope everybody else learned as much as we did. Thanks to the Fairfield County Center for Housing Opportunity for helping us with tonight's presentation. We hope to do our next one on April 15th. And when we'll be gathering updates on the legislative session, and we'll be in touch with who our speakers are. If you've signed up, we'll reach out to you via email, and we'll try to get it publicized elsewhere. So thank you so much, Sara. This was wonderful.
Thank you, Sara. That was great. And thanks, everybody. Have a good night.